The Bonners Ferry annual autumn festival brought visitors from neighboring towns in celebration of the harvest and Halloween. Families gathered on the park grounds, situated on top of a large bluff overlooking the roaring Kootenai River below, to enjoy a day filled with barbecues, campfires, and ghost stories. Children were dressed in their best costumes and ran happily through the piles of bright orange and yellow leaves. Frisbees and footballs flew through the air, and there was tag, hide-and-seek, and the sound of horseshoes as they connected with their targets. Mothers kept an eye on their children while tending to the broad array of casserole dishes, steaming pots of corn on the cob, pies, cakes, and trays of homemade cookies, and of course the fathers that stood like masters of the sea in front of the barbecue pits, brushing secret sauces onto large, sizzling slabs of pork ribs. The park always looked fantastic on Halloween. Every year a decorating committee converged on the park, stringing black and orange streamers across the front of the picnic tables, hanging ghosts, bats, and ghoulish green witches in the trees. There were piles of bright orange pumpkins, and scarecrows stood guard along the tree line. Bales of hay served as a barrier to keep the little ones away from the flying horseshoes, and down a wide, winding path through the park and into the trees was an old abandoned house. Just before sunset, candles in the windows would be lit, and the jack-o'-lanterns leading the way would begin to cast their eerie smiles. They spent the entire day feasting, visiting, and watching the parade of floats, emergency vehicles, horse-drawn carriages, and the Moy Springs High School marching band. The mayor of Moy Springs, a large city just north of Bonners Ferry, sat atop a bright convertible with Miss Moy Springs, her Miss Moy Springs sash draped across the front of her best silk gown, her tiara glittering on her head. Both waved proudly. In annual Halloween tradition, someone would always bring up the subject of the legend of Bonners Ferry. It was a favorite tale, the prelude to the haunted house, as the sun began to sink. Everyone gathered around the campfire under the rising moon and listened to the story of Zebulon Bonner, the first homesteader in these parts. The children sat close to their parents, quiet as mice. It happened 200 years ago. The young Zebulon and his wife Sarah built their cabin in the bluffs just above the Kootenai River, not far from where they sat. How Zebulon lost his wife and 2 young daughters in the frigid waters of the powerful river, and how Zebulon disappeared days later, never to be seen again. The children sat wide-eyed as the story continued. The following year, just days before the festival, households were interrupted by a mournful wailing sound. It echoed through the mountains and valleys again and again. It was a spooky and almost desperate cry, which would cause the hair to rise on the arms of even the bravest of souls. Some say it was Zebulon's ghost, come back from the dead, searching for the bodies of his lost family that had never been found. Then came the scariest part of all. 20 years ago, Old Man Johnson disappeared. When he finally emerged from the forest, he had gone quite mad, whispering about monsters, fairies, and giants, terrified of his own shadow. Then one day his body was found on the banks of the Kootenai. Folks said there were claw marks in the mud, like he had tried desperately to climb the bank. His flesh had been terribly torn up, and his lifeless eyes were still open in sheer terror. Then there were the children that disappeared throughout the years, venturing into the forests, never to be found. Boo! There were sudden shrieks and screams from every child gathered around the fire, then clapping and laughter at such a great scare. "It's just a story," some parents would say, as they smiled at their children's spooky delight. But every resident of Bonners Ferry couldn't deny the fact that every autumn, just before the festival, the wailing cries could still be heard echoing through the valleys. Not only that, but several years ago, on Halloween night, festival-goers swore they saw witches flying in the night sky over the park. Most folks thought it hogwash, yet others insisted it was truth. Every year they would tell the story, insisting that the Bonner homestead was haunted and filled with buried treasure. and every year the story grew a little more gruesome than the year before. That was what made Bonner's Ferry interesting and mysterious. That was how the legend was kept alive, as if the very name, Bonner's Ferry, was wrapped in unspeakable horrors, which drew the curious, the ghost hunters, and those in search of mystical forces. Legends never died. And so it was that 3 years ago a new family bought and moved on to the old Bonner homestead. That family had no idea how their lives would be turned upside down as they joined the population and the legend of Bonner's Ferry.